Hi, my name is Tina Orsolic Dalessio and welcome to the Introduction to Still Life Painting. I'm a classically trained artist who specializes in painting from life under natural light in the medium of oil paint. I received my formal academic training at the Florence Academy of Arts in Italy, where I graduated. In this course, I will be teaching you step by step how to get started with painting the still life in oil. The aim of this course is to give a general overview of still life painting through a theoretical discussion and practical demonstrations. The course will be divided in several main parts. The first part will consist of a brief overview of the art history and symbolism of still life painting. In the second part, we will discuss principles of pictorial composition and study historic examples of still life painting. Then, in the third part of this course, we will be setting up our own still life. In the fourth part, we'll do a small color study of the chosen setup in order to put our choices to test. After making the final decision on our composition, we'll do a transfer drawing for our painting. Then, in the sixth part of this course, we'll transfer the drawing onto the canvas and, based on it, do an underpainting in one color. Finally, from the underpainting, we'll move on to the actual painting, using the full palette. While this process may seem excessively slow, it is how art students are taught at the best art academies today. From my personal experience, I can say that the extra time put into carefully studying your subject and learning how to set up properly produces great results for the students. One of the goals with this course is to demystify the process of becoming an artist. There's nothing secretive about it. Adding content of extraordinary value that propels human consciousness forward. By being an artist, you're becoming a drop in that river of consciousness that really makes us as humans evolve. Let's get started. Okay, so let's do the second study, again painting by Chardin, this time a slightly different composition, as we'll see in a moment. So here, as you can already tell, we don't really have a triangular composition. We have either what we can see as an L composition, that is reversed L, or we could also describe this as a steelyard composition, where one larger object is balanced on one side of the painting and then there are other things balancing it out throughout the painting. So this is your typical steelyard thing. There are other elements in between, but we have a big and then a smaller object balancing. You could also see it again as an L or reversed L composition because the weight is put on the right side of the painting. Again, in terms of light source, we have one source of light, which creates this beautiful flow of light throughout the painting. It's coming from, again, perhaps he was painting this on the same countertop as the previous image. Light is clearly coming from the left, so we have cast shadows on the right side. Now, again, we have, let's just see, we're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm just trying to give myself enough space for the other studies. Again, a traditional crop, which is, or format, which is rectangle placed horizontally. And in terms of value, we'll again start with line just to help ourselves a bit with the preliminary drawing. But in terms of value, what you guys can see when you squint down is that there is a darker mid-tone background and then lighter objects are placed against it. So we have a slightly different value scheme from our previous image where we had mid-tone and darker and lighter objects too. in a triangular composition placed against a light mid-tone background. So here, the same countertop, one level, we have the surface on which it lies. Again, one thing to mention in terms of both of these paintings is that they are both, objects are placed at an eye level. So the choice that Chardin was frequently making when he was painting his still lifes, and this is pretty much the most standard thing to do, is to have your objects placed at an eye level. Sometimes, often actually, we see still lifes where the painter is looking down on the objects. Rarely you see painter looking up at the objects. If you have them too high up, then the surface on which they sit are basically going to be, cutting the object. You won't see where is the bottom of it. So you don't want that kind of arrangement in your paintings because it just looks a bit awkward. So let's go back to analyzing this image. We have possibly the strongest contrast in this section, right? This is where the focal point is, I would say, because we have a sharp, relatively sharp edge, actually not that sharp, but not too soft either. Here is where the attention goes of the viewer. So we have the white jug. Then pay attention to the intervals. This is the surface on where the things are sitting. Let's just block it in quickly. Cast shadow, again bleeding into the edge of the mug. Look, this is a white mug. And what typically a beginner would do is, just have a sharp edge and then the bottom of the mug and then a shadow. And then make this far too light in terms of value. But what in fact Chardin is doing beautifully, just to describe things as a mass, is that he is maybe even artificially darkening. Take a look at this little L shape here, artificially darkening what is in fact a white object, just to not make it too separate from its shadow. So these kinds of little things teach us a lot in terms of how we can conceive of our own inanimate objects in still life painting and in general. Again, this is the principle that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is compression of values. Now look at this beautiful little section here, which I'm getting to. Both the apple and the mug against the background are so softly handled. So they basically bleed into the background in terms of value. There's a bit of shadow cast onto the white mug by the apple itself, because as we said, the light source is on its left side. Then we have this shape coming here. Then we have again another very soft edge of the higher apple against the background, and the reason why he's doing that is to describe what comes in front and what comes in the back. Things, as they move into the background, they get blurrier. So this is a gorgeous way to describe, again, what's in front and what's in the back. Make sure you respect the rules of perspective as you're moving through the ground plane, and have things described as if they're sitting on the same surface. Here we have again the same little trick he applied in the previous painting, which is to have a diagonally placed object cutting the foreground. And that leads the eye into the painting and explains how perspective moves through the painting. So again, where the white cup and the knife meet, soft edge, beautifully described. Not to have objects too separate from each other. Same thing here, where the knife creates a shadow, it beautifully bleeds into this surface. Let's move on to bigger shapes. Here we have a clump of apples and one pear. Now, notice one interesting thing, and this is again something as a beginner you should always pay attention to, a mass. Here we have one big element, which is its own mass. It's beautifully connected with this knife to the other set of elements on this side of the image. And these elements, as you're starting to think about them in your own painting or when studying other people's paintings, don't conceive them as separate objects, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Instead, see them as one big shape. So we're going to have this pear and these apples basically connect. And then, as you have seen that this is one bigger shape, you can later start discerning small varieties between them, start thinking about how to describe edges and their placement as opposed to each other, overlaps. But as a beginning principle, think big, then go small, and start defining how things are handled or related to each other in your own still life. So, what we are gonna now do is take the softest charcoal I have, and I'm gonna quickly block in the contours of my image. We have, let's see, that inclination, so the cup will be ending around here, and that's about the right amount of space on top. Always something to keep in mind also in still life painting is to leave enough space above, but not too much, not to make your subject matter look short, and also to leave some space underneath, not to have it kind of awkwardly placed in the image. So now let's just use our dark charcoal and block this quickly in, not to waste too much time. So here I'm starting to block in the darks. I'm gonna make sure that I'm connecting all the shadows with the background, have a nice flow in the image of light and dark. This is typically what we tend to go for. Again, for these kinds of studies, allow yourself to use your hand, use a brush, use whatever it takes to just soften and quickly understand what is going on in the image. So these little apples, they do have their highlights, but there are predominantly mid-tone objects with some areas of dark. So let's keep going with the background.
Well, the great thing about NMA is that being in the program for almost 2 years, I did start to see how all of the elements that we're taught come together. Now it's easier to kind of build that foundation and then build on top of it because the foundation is strong.
Here, as we said, we want this mug to pop, right? So here we're going to keep the edge a bit sharper, and then as it goes down, we're going to make it bleed into these two, soften. One little trick Chardin often uses is that he gradates the background, as you can see. So here, even though the light is coming from that side, he's actually making that background darker in that section, and then he's lightening it here, and that creates a beautiful sense of atmosphere through the image. Don't worry about little charcoal bits and pieces falling around. Again, we're not trying to create a masterpiece, it's just a study. having these objects connect. Now, in terms of having certain things pop, we can already use a little bit of a white chalk just to get that white jug to be a little bit stronger against the background, but not too strong. There are some highlights on this apple, especially in this section here. I hope this is reading well to you, that it's not getting any sort of glare, which would make the highlights look too strong. Then we have a tiny little highlight on this apple, which is a nice way to, again, describe what comes in front and what's in the back. So this one is getting a darker value here because it's in the shadow. Let's quickly go down to the vertical planes, which are especially this part, which is not receiving any light, and then make sure that this part is not too light. Compression of values, back to that. The knife and its shape casting the shadow, and again connecting this dark to the other vertical plane. Right? Soft edges, some accents. There's a nice little line here, perspective line leading your eye. All right, so let's go back to our sections of bigger sections of painting in terms of defining elements and see what kind of choices was Chardin making there. One thing we said, soft edge of the farthest object, which is this apple, in order to describe how things move in space. Slightly sharper edge over here, and then sharper yet, as you can see over here. Let me change my charcoal and move on to something that doesn't create quite as much mess. So here we can conceive of this edge and this beautiful reflected light as quite soft. Be careful with reflected lights. It's better to, again, compression of values, it's better to understate them than overstate them because they draw a lot of attention. The eye goes straight to those reflected lights because they're a light within the shadow. And you don't want the eye to go to the shadow, so try to make your shadows a bit more simplified. Our advice at the Academy, I do like shadows that have color vibration in them, but when we were studying at the Academy, we were advised to keep our shadows flat, more graphic looking. And then you can always, add as your learning curve goes upwards, you can always make adjustments and make different choices. But in the beginning, it is quite useful to just conceive of a shadow in more simple terms. So let's see, where did we... Here we have some shadow cast from the apples. Again, notice how this edge is totally invisible, even though if there is a hint of reflected light, it's the softest, beautiful edge of the eye of the apple meeting the shadow it's casting. Also notice how the background values and colors are used by Chardin in the objects themselves. And the good reason to do that is in order to marry the background to the subject matter. Otherwise, they look like they're not part of the same context, and that's definitely not the case. So here we have slightly darker value, progressively getting lighter as we move. Soft, soft, soft edge against the background. The background here becomes lighter than the mug itself, notice. So light against dark, dark against light. A nice way to make things pop. Even if it's the same object we are talking about. Here we have a hint of darker value to describe what's going on in this section. Let's see how we can adjust. Where there is a lot of chroma, like, sections in here where red pops, always make sure to squint to actually see what the proper values are. So this is lighter than the background, but not so much lighter, and the edge is quite soft. Let's keep working our way around. Chardin uses this beautiful method of mainly having soft edges where objects meet, which again makes it easier to discern what are these big masses and simplified shape designs rather than having the eye stop in each and every section where a new object appears. So let's just clean this up a little bit. It got a bit muddy. Here we said the edge is quite soft. Here we can make things pop. This little handle here is catching a bit of light, so we can have that described a bit better. So I'm going to step back now, reassess my drawing and see if this corresponds. Adjustments could still be made. Make sure. This goes back to the compression of value trick or principle that you always have to keep in mind. See, for instance, I drew that initially as a stronger line just to describe what's going on with the perspective, right? To explain you how he used these little lines to lead the eye around. But this has to be really subdued in order for the eye not to pick it up as a high contrast in a part of the image that's really not important and doesn't want to have the eye stop there, right? It's not the focal point. It's not our objective to focus on this little area. So hint at it and make sure you respect the values that correspond to the same planes. Let's work our way around the image a bit more. I feel that our biggest issue right now is that we still haven't quite got the value of the background, partly because I was working with the brush, so I took off some of the charcoal. So we can go a touch darker, especially in this section around the vase, around the mug where things tend to pop a little bit more. See this beautiful sharper edge that kind of lifts the mug off of the background. And then we can go darker yet in this part of the image here. So let's see how is this looking. We can lift the surface of the countertop a bit up. Define the edges of the painting. Now, one thing he's not using in these compositions, but we will see those kinds of examples in other artists' works, is that he doesn't have things flow other than shadows themselves, but he doesn't have elements in his paintings flow out of the image. As we discussed, it's sometimes advisable to do that because it makes it less artificially set up. It makes it a little bit more sort of organic looking and a little bit more spontaneous. This can be darkened still. These two can be connected. Soft edges between objects. Shadow bleeding into the objects that's casting it. Still, when you describe where the objects sit, you can put a bit of an accent just to make, make sure it's really grounded. It's not floating around the picture. Here, this edge, though not completely sharp, is where the contrast is happening. So let's make sure we define that. Darken these areas so the eye doesn't go there. And maybe try to get that white mug to pop a bit more against the dark background. You can isolate or go back to isolating some lights. But again, you can get, stuck with these kinds of little studies for a long time if you really, really want to go deep into it. But the object here is just to get a general idea of what are the compositional choices, what kind of value scheme, what kind of crop and format works, and what can we deduce from that for our own purposes. Let's play around a little bit more and then we'll wrap it up. The shadow comes down nicely, so it's all not on the same level. Make sure we bring that down a bit. Make sure we bring this apple down a little bit. The knife connecting nicely. This object is here to not just lead the eye through the ground plane and lead us into the picture, but also to connect these separate elements in the painting. And the edge, again, between them is super, super nice and soft. There's some beautiful little accents of light on the knife itself. We can sharpen some of the edges because they're not soft all throughout in order to describe the surface on which the objects are sitting. This could be darkened still. There is a darker section over here too, where the apple is in shadow, the background apple. And you can see that the eye can on its own make sense of certain things that are super soft. So you really don't need to go out of your way and define every single thing in an image. On the other hand, not everything needs to be always soft. Like we said, you can intentionally lead the eye around the picture with certain pointers and accents. So you don't need to have just one focus and then everything else be in blur around it. That's not necessarily the advice I would give. All right, so I think this gives us a general idea. We could keep working around the image, find smaller shapes of shadow and light, but we can discern that things can be masked in one thing. We have your steelyard or L composition in place, more or less. We have lighter objects against the darker background. Here you can soften this edge a little bit more. And we have those beautiful pointers and accents leading the eye around. So there you have it.